here. My name is Paul Smith. I'm with basically the Rural Counties Association. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning. Been thinking about what Mr. Cooley said about telling somebody that their future lies in someone else's head. I'm trying to apply that to my two teenage boys, and I'm struggling this morning with that. But we'll let it apply and take it from there. Let me tell you a little bit about RCRC and walk you through kind of our recent history and what I think the future holds, not only for rural county land and cultivation, but also some of the things that I think Tim and others would want to hear in terms of what could we fix to make things better, and I'll touch about that. First of all, RCRC, we are a 34-member county organization, primarily the rural areas of the state, the cultivating areas of the state, to be frank. So we have in our membership Humboldt, Trinity, Nevada, Calaveras, and all of those types of small counties, and particularly in the north, where marijuana is basically a part of the culture and part of my life. I answer to a board of directors that contains 34 county supervisors. So each member has a supervisor that sits on my board, but I'm in contact with basically many of the 5 in each respective member county. And of course, all of them have different opinions and different thoughts about where we go on marijuana, but I will come to some of the things that we are unified on here in just a second. I tell people the story of walking the halls on the last night of session in 2013, where my colleague from the California State Association of Counties, a group that has all 58 counties, we were walking those halls and we were trying to defeat a last-minute gut amendment, much the nature that John alluded to over the years. This was a practice we went through every year where we couldn't get consensus, let alone agreement on how to approach medical marijuana. And so we kept fighting them, and obviously every year there'd be a gut amendment, and we go to the last night of session trying to stop those bills. As each bill progressed, though, when we got through 2013, we started to scratch our head because the language of each bill got a little bit better, a little less offensive, at least to counties. And we also saw things changing in the courts, saw things changing in federal law, and obviously the move to Congress. So we realized that at some point we just can't say no, that we're going to have to embrace some type of parameters of which counties, and particularly rural counties, cultivating counties, live with. So we undertook a very extensive review of basically what can counties live with. And let me share with you what were the top 5 and then a couple other things, and you'll start to understand how the regulatory framework got through the legislature this past year. Our first priority was non-negotiable, just not going to talk about anything unless we have this component, and that's what I think folks have already alluded to, which is local control. Cities, counties have done a very good job of prevailing in the courts to test our parameters of what can be local control, meaning time, place, and manner of how cultivation can occur, retail sales can occur, even just the general movement of marijuana, medical marijuana, through a distribution chain. That, again, sacrosanct, non-negotiable, and I think everywhere on municipal land would agree. Our second was basically ending the collective model, using another scheme to monitor, regulate, track, whatever you want to call it, license. We wanted to make sure we, in fact, had a licensing scheme, that we knew who was growing, we knew what they were growing, when, how, why. We knew who the retailers are, we knew who the transporters are, we knew who manufacturers were, and of course, all of that would mean a fundamental change from what we've had with SB 420 and then obviously the Compassionate Use Act. The third was explicit county taxing authority. This was extremely important in county land, cultivation county land, and something we vigorously fought for, and you will see it both in the package as well as in the initiative. And that basically is a lesson learned from Colorado, whereby cultivating counties need to somehow share in the revenue within the industry. We always believed that the revenue that would be the revenue model most easily used and gravitated to would be sales tax or excise tax at the point of sale. And we were very concerned about that, and we still are. So we wanted to make sure that counties were provided explicit county taxing authority, meaning if a county wanted to levy some type of cultivation tax or otherwise, it would be afforded that. You may say, well, that already exists in current law, and you're probably right. What we have found is that litigation comes at every twist and turn in the medical marijuana world, and we wanted to nullify those legal challenges so that a 7-year lawsuit only became a 2-year lawsuit, and the proceeds that would be levied wouldn't be eaten by litigation costs, and those proceeds could do exactly what they were supposed to do in those counties. The fourth was money for the environment. Somehow, some effort to really get down and deal with the environmental degradation in rural California. And I think Erin already spoke to a lot of that in the work that her organization and sister organizations are doing. We wanted that very clear as a priority. We wanted resources to it. And we wanted to make sure there was coordination between state agencies as well as state and local governments as it deals with protecting the environment. The fifth is kind of one of the little more controversial, and John and I may have a different opinion on this, but we wanted a state-centric model. Quite frankly, we weren't necessarily afraid in county land of the ABC, but we weren't necessarily wedded to the ABC. We were wedded to making sure there was a state-centric approach, and that locals would have a relatively minor role other than time, place, and manner traditional land use decisions. Obviously, we compromised on that, and hence you have a dual system of licensing, dual systems of enforcement. But it was really important for rural counties that we not be left holding the bag to carry forth a regulatory scheme which we may not have the resources on, we may not have the manpower on, and we could be overwhelmed by industry players politically. The two other minor things that were important but nevertheless are priorities, and that was obviously as John alluded to, restricting cross-ownership of license. We don't want the Walmartization. We certainly don't want Walmartization in a county like of 14,000 people like Trinity, or a county like Sierra where there's only 3,000 people, where the politics and the industry can become so powerful they just overwhelm, both from a policy standpoint and a market standpoint, those political jurisdictions. The other was making sure counties as employers could impose some type of reasonable restrictions on employee use of marijuana, medical marijuana, not just at work, but throughout the entire day because of our litigation exposure on the Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act. So those were our main components of what we pursued. I'm happy to say that we got most everything achieved in those objectives, other than a dual licensing scheme, which we now have, and we will obviously implement and go forth from there. Let me talk a little bit about, I think, what the things are that we would like to have seen in that package, and we'll see where that takes us in the coming years, either regulatory or statutorily. Tim already alluded to one of three. It's actually our third priority, and that's to clean up the financial system as it relates to industry players. We basically need financial institutions to come into the scheme. Like the Board of Equalization, we do not want you to show up and pay your property tax in cash. We think that's just not a very healthy thing to do. We need to create new financial mechanisms. But the other two that I think take priority even over that is, one, our continued request to see more and more resources dealing with the environment and the environmental impacts. The governor has been very good to this, giving some resources to Erin's group and Erin's sister organizations, general fund money to do some cleanup and attack the degradation issues, but we need to do more. My members have signed on to supporting a cultivation tax, with those cultivation tax proceeds going back to address the environmental issues, both locally and at the state level. We think that's paramount. We applaud what was done in the package, but quite frankly, it's just simply not enough to rely on fines and penalties to get the environmental issues addressed. We know there's also a regulatory effort, there are waiver discharge fees, etc. But again, I think the cultivation tax is probably the best way to go to get some serious money to tackle what is a serious environmental issue throughout the state. The second big concern that we have is obviously how are the regulatory agencies going to behave in the rulemaking process. As you know, earlier on the bills were much more detailed in prescribing to the regulatory agencies what needs to be done. For whatever reason, there was a back seat or a back step taken, and the regulatory agencies were afforded broad authority. We're concerned about a number of things I'll highlight for you in terms of how this rulemaking is going to play out. First is what constitutes local approval. We use the term local licensing very interchangeable. The bill really don't say local licensing, they more or less say local approval. We are very keen to see what the state is going to accept as to what is that local approval and how are they going to verify it, particularly in cultivation, where cultivation approval starts at the local level and then moves on to the state. The other is the timeline of licensing. I think it's unrealistic to think that we're going to flip a switch on January 1, 2018 and everybody's going to have licenses on their merry way. With the Department of Food and Agriculture undertaking an EIR process, that's going to take some time, and until you get the cultivation licensing scheme up and running, I think it impacts everything else down the distribution chain, including retailing, transporting, manufacturing. So we're very eager to see how the state is going to come up with their regulatory timeline for handing out licenses or making those license applications available. Transportation standards, the law was very clear that was going to get punted. We are very concerned. We expect a lot of medical marijuana to be moving through unincorporated areas, rural counties, obviously, because again, we are the growing parts of the state, so we're very concerned about that. And then finally, the track and trace details. Wanted to see how that's going to play out. Again, not just from the revenue side that I think the Board of Equalization is concerned about, but obviously at CDFA, how that's all going to be implemented, where counties and county enforcement entities are going to fit in that track and trace scheme. Let me end briefly by just saying, I think what three points going into the future as to, I think, the perspective of my members in the counties that we represent. First is counties getting more comfortable. Counties have had, particularly cultivating counties, have had years and years of quote-unquote experience in this issue. So we may be a little ahead of the game as opposed to urban areas and or maybe cities in terms of how we're approaching this, because again, we have history of how to deal with it from a regulatory standpoint. I think as we move forward to a more responsible, well-regulated scheme with clearly defined rules, you're going to see perhaps a liberalization, and I think many counties are also going to see economic opportunities available, particularly on the cultivation side. But that's not going to happen if we don't do the regulatory process justice and have a good regulatory scheme coming out. The second is don't expect uniformity in counties, particularly rural counties and cultivating counties. Each of those counties are going to do their local approval process differently. I can assure you that very few are going to be handing out licenses. Very few are going to hand out permits. Many of them are going to rely on their codes and their land use practices to guide what constitutes local government approval, or at least county approval. And just be aware that 34, 35, 58 counties are going to do it differently. They're all going to have a different approach, and we have to accept that. And that's basically the cornerstone of local control and what we fought so hard for. And then finally, we can't really make all of these decisions without knowing that there is a ballot measure out there, and we have to be mindful of what those rules are under the ballot measure as we walk forward. It's debatable whether or not it's going to pass, I understand that, but we have to at least be mindful that it's out there, and we have to make sure that we don't basically come in crosshairs with an industry that could take advantage of us under the initiative, or take advantages of us under the medical marijuana side. There's going to have to be basically some agreement about where we go, knowing that both schemes are likely to be the law of the land in the future. Again, thank you for allowing me to share some comments. I unfortunately am not going to be able to stay much past 11. I've got other major commitments going on this issue in the state capitol, but I will say it's a pleasure to be here and an honor to participate with all of the folks up here.